Says it's live.
It's live. All right. Hello. Welcome to our live stream of our third Thursday program on women's suffrage in Vermont, 100 years of women's suffrage in Vermont. A few quick housekeeping notes. Thank you for tuning in to our talk today at the Vermont Historical Society. Hopefully this brings some fun and some interest into your day. I want to let you know that we're also at the Vermont Historical Society talking and thinking a lot about other things sort of like this or other presentations or information, historical tidbits that we can keep sharing with you so we can all sort of continue to feel part of Vermont's history community, even if we may all be in our own houses on our couches during these next couple of weeks. So thank you for hanging out with us today, hopefully with your lunch on a comfy couch at home. I also want to say a huge thank you to our two presenters. You can't see this on the screen, but everyone in this room is very carefully at least 6 feet away from each other. We are practicing and modeling good, healthy behaviors, and we have been all setting up for this program. So thank you, a huge thank you to Lynne and Rachel for coming in today. On a note for some upcoming things, a lot of our upcoming programs have been either modified, canceled, changed, what have you. Please stay tuned to the Facebook page where you are right now, or vermonthistory.org for modifications or new announcements or anything like that that we are trying to keep on top of. Also a housekeeping note, the Vermont Historical Society is currently closed to the public, so you cannot come to either the museum or the Vermont History Center, but we are also very responsive by email from our various remote work sites, so if you have some questions or you have things you want to pitch to us, go right ahead. We are very reachable during this time. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to announce our two speakers today. Rachel Onuf is, I'm going to get her exact title for you, the Vermont Historical Records Program Director at the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. And she, along with our speaker, Lynne Blackwell, who is an outstanding Vermont historian, are the co-chairs of the research committee of the Vermont Suffrage Centennial Alliance. And they have been doing just some absolutely extraordinary work to research and then tell the story of suffrage here, women's suffrage here in Vermont, digging up some great new information, making sure that information is shared, and then being part of this broad statewide alliance to celebrate 100 years of women's suffrage. So they're going to talk about the work that they have been doing, as well as the work of that Centennial Alliance during our talk today. They will be specifically asking for questions at the very end of this presentation, but if you have some questions in the meantime, you can type them in. Staff that you can't see that are off camera and still 6 feet away from each other, I promise, will be monitoring the Facebook feed and will be able to pitch your questions to them through this live stream. So, with that in mind, let's get started.
Wonderful. Oh, claps already. I love it. Thank you, Amanda, and thanks so much to Vermont Historical Society for your flexibility and agility in terms of finding a way to make sure that this program can go forward, even under the challenges we're currently facing. Lynne's going to do a deep dive and tell you all about some of the wonderful women she's found out about who are active in the Vermont suffrage movement. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Vermont Suffrage Centennial Alliance and specifically the work of the Research and History Committee that we've been involved with, and also suggest some things that maybe you all could do while you're wondering what you can be doing. So, the Vermont Suffrage Centennial Alliance is a project that is spearheaded by the Vermont League of Women Voters chapter, and the Vermont Commission on Women, and myself have been involved with it since the fall of 2018. We started meeting monthly that fall, and every meeting for several months we get a larger group of people, over 37 organizations, and many individuals are now involved with the group. And we spent a lot of time over 2019 determining what it is we would want to try to do to celebrate and commemorate the passage of the 19th Amendment. I encourage you to look at our website, vtsuffrage2020.org. We also have a presence on Facebook to find out more about the movement, to find out more about it at the national level, as well as Vermont. We spent some time developing a timeline that puts what was happening in Vermont within a national context, We also have links to other online resources that we've curated, so they're some of the best that we think are out there, because there are lots of resources to be looked at. We also try to address the incomplete legacy of the 19th Amendment and the fact that it did not immediately mean that all women were enfranchised and had no problem casting their vote in ballot boxes. So we really lay that out there, and is part of what we are trying to talk about when we talk about the history of the suffrage movement. Even if in Vermont specifically it was not something that was necessarily playing out. We also encourage people to engage with our process either by joining the Alliance or by taking the pledge, which is basically saying that you're going to be thoroughly informed about the issues and you're going to vote come November 2020. So I encourage you to go to the site and spend some time looking at our resources, seeing where those links that we include take you. I'd also love for you to save these dates and cross your fingers. We have some things that we are planning ourselves as an alliance, and others that we are co-sponsoring, like the Symposium at the Ethan Allen Homestead, which is slated to happen on May 16th. And again, that might be the kind of thing where if we're not able to do it in person, it will be able to be streamed. So stay tuned, and again, updates will be available on our website and Facebook page. We also have a 5K suffrage scramble planned for Waterbury Duxbury on August 15th as a kind of preamble to our big event, which would be a parade and Suffrage Fest in Montpelier, downtown, and then on the State House lawn. Another thing that we've done is try to aggregate events that others are doing and putting them on our website, on the events calendar, which the Commission on Women has graciously shared with us. So all of the Suffrage Centennial events are in purple. There's also a speakers bureau that our wonderful member Sandy Dooley has put together. It includes a dozen different speakers on all manner of suffrage topics, from more traditional history to cartooning for suffrage. Linda Radke will sing you songs from the suffrage movement. Oh look, there's Lynne! So, and if you click on any of those, you can get a description of what the speaker can talk about, their availability, and other logistical details of how to reach them. So I encourage you to think about reaching out to them in hopes that we'll be able to have more in-person events before the end of 2020. And also maybe reach out to them and see how agile they are, and whether they might be able to present something virtually for you and your organization. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the work that I've been doing as co-chair of the Research and History Committee. As the Vermont Suffrage Centennial Alliance was getting underway, I was asked if I would be the Vermont coordinator for an ongoing project that's a national project called the Online Biographical Dictionary of the Women's Suffrage Movement in the United States. Melody Gustafson, a professor at University of Vermont, had been the coordinator first and had gotten many of her students and others around the state to write biographical sketches of Vermont women who were involved in the movement. These people tended to be, some of them are well known and the kind of people that Lynne will be speaking about. Others, harder to find out more about them. And you may only have Mrs. Merritt D. Chittenden to go by, and then you have to try to find out more about this woman and what her role was and about her life. So we've got about 2,000 sketches already online, and again, crowdsourced throughout the country. Some students in New Hampshire have helped us out with some of our sketches. There's still more to do. We've got about 80 up for Vermont, but I have at least a dozen names. And the more time I spend looking at the Vermont Equal Suffrage Association conference, I see more names. So there's people who need some research done for them, so please be in touch if you're interested in doing a sketch. Another thing is a collaboration among the Vermont Historical Society, University of Vermont Special Collections Library, and Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, where I am based. UVM has graciously agreed to put up a women's suffrage in Vermont collection, a digital library of primary sources relating to the movement in Vermont. So far we have a number of annual reports up. We will also be adding some of the correspondence that is part of the Vermont Historical Society's collections. From the state archives, we're contributing voter tallies for each town that show in 1920 how many men and how many women were registered to vote. And we also have a bunch of petitions that, periodically, because this was such a long haul, women and sometimes men would write petitions to the legislature in support of suffrage for women. So you see, we have ones from 1858, 1870, 1904, just they kept trying. So we're also going to add those as well. Again, a valuable source of names of women who were active enough, engaged enough in the movement to sign a petition at the very least. So as an archivist, I'm really interested in discovering primary sources and making them accessible. So in addition to the collaboration with UVM and VHS, I've also I've got a bit of a vision for Election Day 2020. Many towns are already doing projects, Waterbury, Worcester, Dorset, that are involved in talking about, at the hyper-local level, what suffrage activities were happening in their town, what women were involved. And I think it would be wonderful if, this is again my vision I'm sharing with you, and I feel like this is an opportunity, as we are maybe sequestered a bit in the next few weeks. It would be wonderful if come November there could be pop-up exhibits at the polling places in every town and city in Vermont, either featuring women who were known who voted, or that we think they voted, that's the best we might be able to extrapolate, or they focus on some other aspect of the 1920 election, or even just some other aspect of life in town 100 years ago, if suffrage per se does not interest you. But I'd love for this to be based on research by citizen researchers in every locality. And so I task all of you who are listening out there in Facebook land, please think of how you might get involved with or participate in such a project. And if you're not, please think about how you could. If you are already, please let me know more about what you're doing. And what is my role? I see myself as a facilitator, that I can help you access resources that you may not be aware of. I can serve as a cheerleader. I can connect you to other people who are doing similar work. And thinking ambitiously, it may be that we can have some sort of centralized map-based digital exhibit that would link out to some of the work that you all do, either to the primary sources or to the write-ups and the articles that you develop based on your research. So not every town is as lucky as Jericho. They actually have the checklist of all the first women voters in 1920. If your town has this, that is amazing. This is the only town we've heard about. And there's a town clerk looking pleased as punch, as she should be. For most of us, it's a lot tougher to try to figure out which women were voting. Some of the resources that could be of use are, as I mentioned, these tallies of registered voters that are listed by town that we have in the state archives collections that will be available digitally. The census for 1920, and this is freely available, and you can browse it for your specific town and download it. It's a little clunky, and then you have to download each page, but I live in Washington, 14 pages. Within half an hour, I had that raw data on my hard drive and could start to really mine it. And the census data is just fascinating. You may find yourself going down all manner of rabbit holes as you start to look at, okay, so how many women here are of voting age compared to how many are actually registered? And you can stick with those kind of high-level statistical questions, or you can start to say, okay, so these women, are they heads of household because they're widowed? Do they have tons of kids? Are they living on farms that are assessed at high value? what can you start to determine for their socioeconomic status? So there's information in that primary source, and if you're lucky, you can triangulate that with town records. Fortunately in Vermont, voters are required to be administered, they have to take the Freeman's Oath. True today, true back then. And not all town clerks, but many were really good about listing the names of the people who were administered the oath. So you can go to your town record books and see who's there. So this is all Brookfield information here. The tally includes Brookfield, that's Brookfield Census, and that's one of the pages from the town records. And you might want to actually triangulate that for, I counted in the Brookfield records, there were 65 women's names. And look, I got some verifications from the Barre Daily Times says, in the third little paragraph, and again, many diversions in terms of the other fascinating information you will find in these papers, but 65 ladies in town qualified to become voters, and their names were placed on the checklist. So, boom, good. 65 women in Brookfield were ready to vote. Again, may not ever be able to find out if they actually voted, but we at least know that they were prepared to vote, which is something. One thing I just want to point out, and be a little into my own learning curve, and I've learned to approach sources with some humility and try to recognize what assumptions I might have as I go into them. And just one example was those registered voters at the state level. I initially thought that was how many women voted, but it became clear that was not a statistic that the state kept for another decade or so. So it's only the number who were registered, it was not the number who voted. Another thing, just to bear in mind, so one of the women who did one of the biographical sketches for me last year worked with Waterbury Historical Society and said, oh yeah, they gave me this really great image of a parade in Waterbury. And I thought, fantastic, that's so great. It's a 4th of July parade, you know it's 1912, and it's got suffragists in it. That's so amazing. It was not a really good scan, and I don't know, maybe Amanda's already looking at it skeptically, but I've very recently got a much better scan and went, and this was someone who was working with Paul Carnahan, the wonderful librarian at VHS, and they're like, wait a second, those aren't women, those are men. And yes, and then you look at that down with the tyrant man sign, and you're like, yeah, no woman would go out with that crappy looking sign. And again, verifying that by then going to the newspapers. You can't always believe the newspapers, but sometimes you can. They give this amazing description of the order of the parade. And it gets down to, after the Boy Scouts, there was followed by burlesque suffragettes with banners, votes for women. So just saying that you can't always, you've got to kind of be mindful that what you're seeing or what you want to see might not actually be the truth. So I just urge you to think about what research you could do, and much of this material is either available online or I can facilitate your access to it. One thing that is concerning to me is that many town clerk's offices are now closing, so it may be difficult to get some of these records if you are interested in pursuing this. I do have records because I've been collecting them in an ad hoc way for the last year or so. I do have records for about 25 different towns, and I'd be, again, happy to share anything I have and help come up with creative ideas for how you could get some more information. I'll be putting these links on the Facebook page for VHS after our talk today, so follow up with these, follow up with me, and I really hope to hear from you about your research or your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Rachel has just wiped the clicker Blackwell, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Vermont suffragists this morning. But first I want to acknowledge the work of one of my former colleagues, Deborah Clifford. Deborah, years ago, in the 1980s, did some essential research, perhaps the most in-depth research on women's suffrage. And we are totally indebted to her for a lot of the framework of the movement that we were able to grasp. But since then, there's been very little done. And so, as Rachel clearly showed, this is basically a work in progress at the moment. And I will tell you about a few of the more interesting Vermont suffragists. But when we talk about the women's suffrage movement, most people will think about the well-known heroes, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. Those were the national leaders. They traipsed across the U.S. trying to achieve the right to vote. But we rarely know anything, few of us know anything about Vermont suffragists because we had a different kind of movement here. After Stanton and Anthony, many people have learned about Alice Paul. She was the one who developed the Great Parades, the protest, and she helped to end the movement during World War I and to achieve the 19th Amendment. The early histories of women's suffrage recounted the activities of these leaders. In fact, Stanton and Anthony wrote one of the first histories of the women's suffrage movement. And they explained their reasons and how they argued for why women should vote. But they ignored many of the other suffragists who had come along from different ethnic and racial groups, who began to challenge their right to speak for all women. Before the Civil War, Stanton and Anthony had united with black women in their demand for universal voting rights. But after the war, they gradually shifted their strategies in order to cater to the way in which Americans were becoming increasingly infected with greater racial, ethnic, and class bias. Many people were concerned about the fact that black men could now vote. What would they do with the vote? And if you doubled that with black women, what would happen to the nation? So the movement splintered, and African American suffragists especially, and others as well, began working for their rights through their own more separate organizations. But this year, now that we are relooking across the nation at women's suffrage, many people are beginning to ask different kinds of questions. Instead of just why women should vote, we're asking who was left out of our histories and which women could vote. Many African American women were barred from voting in the South particularly, but other places as well, until the Civil Rights Act of 1965. That was long after 1920. Indigenous women did not gain even citizenship until 1924, but because states who were responsible for enfranchising them, they were very slow to do so. And Asian American women could not vote until after 1952. So, passage of the 19th Amendment did not mean that all women could vote. Turning to Vermont, the story is a little bit different. Many of you, and most of us, think of Vermont as a white state. The demographics were different. White middle-class women were also the leaders of the movement here. And they were the ones who had the social support, they had enough economic support, and they had, relatively speaking, a little more leisure time to join the great reform movements of the 19th century. But, of course, like their colleagues elsewhere, they had a degree of racial, ethnic, and class bias that comes out sometimes in their materials that they use to argue with men about why women should vote. What's really most surprising about Vermont is that, given the fact that today Vermont is considered quite a seat of liberalism, the entrenched conservatism of 19th century Vermont lawmakers was really quite amazing as we look at the movement. From the beginning of the movement here, so we're talking about 1847, when this woman, Clarina Howard Nichols, began to talk in her newspaper columns about women's property rights, until 1917. Now that's over 70 years. Really nothing much happened in Vermont. And one of our suffragists, Laura Moore, who was the secretary of the Vermont Women's Suffrage Association, she explained her frustration with the legislative roadblock. During all these years, she bemoaned, this association has been humbly petitioning the legislature for the right of municipal suffrage, and this small crumb of justice is still denied. Now, at that moment, 4 states in the West women had already gained full suffrage rights in those states. So you can see this appeared to be quite frustrating to them. So what was the problem in Vermont? I'm going to talk about 3 of our well-known suffragists here. Clarina Nichols is the first one from Brattleboro, and she sort of represents the pre-Civil War movement in Vermont. The second would be Annette Parmalee from Enosburg Falls, and she was active at the turn of the 20th century. And the third is Lucy J.C. Daniels of Grafton, and she represents the final phase in the last decade before 1920. So Nichols, as I mentioned, was a journalist, and she began advocating for married women's property rights. She was editing her husband's newspaper, the Windham County Democrat, in the late 1840s, and in 1850, she went to the first Women's Rights Convention, the first national convention that was held in Worcester, Massachusetts. And it was at the second convention that she gave her most famous speech, The Responsibilities of Woman. And it was so well received that the other national leaders decided to print it up as a pamphlet. And this is one of the few documents we have that really show the way in which Nichols could captivate audiences. And she was arguing, of course, that women had responsibilities as mothers, and they needed the economic rights in order to protect their children. It was through her association with these national leaders that Nichols finally began to realize that, of course, they needed the vote in order to change laws, because the men were not going to do it easily. And these laws that affected women, she had experienced some of the issues that affected women and saw them in her community all the time. In 1852, Nichols became bold enough to organize a petition. I'm going to go back to her so you can see what she looked like about this time. This is from a daguerreotype. It's actually a portrait that was done from a daguerreotype. So she might have appeared like this in 1852 when she became the first woman to speak at the Vermont State House. She had organized a petition to the Vermont legislature requesting that women be allowed to vote in school meetings. She believed this was an interim wedge into full suffrage rights. She asked to speak to the legislature, and of course this was unheard of. She was greeted with this response from the head of the Education Committee, who the Education Committee had dealt with her petition. And he said, well, if a lady wants to make herself ridiculous, let her come and make herself as ridiculous as possible, and as soon as possible. But I, for one, do not believe in this scramble for the breeches. Well, this was accompanied by a threat that he would present her with a pair of breeches when she arrived at the State House. Well, even so, these lawmakers decided, well, what a curiosity, we'll have to let her speak. And she performed beautifully, at least according to her memoir. She felt very good about this speech. And she posed, of course, as this genteel woman, very educated and respectable, and she pretended to faint before she could continue her speech. And so her opponent concluded, well, in spite of her efforts, Mrs. Nichols could not unsex herself. Even her voice was full of womanly pathos. So to vote was to be manly, obviously. She felt very good about this, but because largely that she had overcome this common form of ridicule, that suffragists were masquerading as men. They would unleash a battle between the sexes, and that would basically reverse the social order in public space and at home as well. She got around this problem by relying on what many people know or call as the cult of true womanhood. She argued that women needed to vote because of their sacred duty as mothers, to raise and protect their children. And in 1853, she was down in New York City in front of 2,000 people when she proclaimed her need for the ballot. I want to have this power because I do not possess the power that ought to belong to me as a mother. And she explained that a noble and affectionate mother who raised 9 children through the perils of infancy and youth was far more important to the community than a husband's wealth. This plea for motherhood ran contrary to the claims of national leaders like Stanton and Anthony and Lucy Stone. Instead of highlighting women's difference, their motherhood, their difference from men, the other leaders were focusing on equality at this time. And that was their argument, that women were equal to men. They pointed to the Declaration of Independence. All people are free and equal. But Nichols was very impressive for her rhetorical skills, and she captivated audiences all over the Northeast. And she told these genteel stories about poor mothers and wastrel fathers, most of whom were, of course, drunken. She believed in this idea wholeheartedly herself, but she was also using it strategically, because otherwise the men would probably not have listened to her. It was very difficult to ridicule this poor selfless mother who was just pleading for the right to protect her children. That is not to say that Nichols ignored the plight of poor women. She adopted the middle class image, but she cared a lot about having all women vote. And she even recommended at one point that the state of Vermont should provide poor relief to replace the meager and horrible system of town poor relief. And that was a very unusual comment that she made in papers, in her paper at the time. Her biggest problem in Vermont was the absence of colleagues. Many women knew very little about the movement. Now, Nichols knew what was happening all over the country because she was a newspaper editor, and she read papers from all over New England. Other women were either unaware, they were indifferent to the issue, or they were too busy on their farms and at their workplaces to do otherwise. They were particularly concerned about mingling in what they called the dirty pool of politics, because politics was done on a personal level in polling places and mostly in taverns. For a woman to go into these spaces was unseemly at the time. Even if they were willing to speak out, they might propose or be sympathetic to enslaved women. They would talk about the horrors of drunken men, but to claim their own rights was to be selfish, and women were supposed to be benevolent and selfless at this time. So there was a big hurdles to overcome, not only for men, but for women as well. And it was for this reason that Nichols was also more comfortable, actually, with temperance and anti-slavery, because in those situations she was pleading for others and not for herself. So in 1853, she was asked to go on a temperance tour in Wisconsin. And this was a great eye-opener for Nichols. It enlightened her about the prospects for reform in the West. She began to see that in the West, the institutions and the laws were just being written, and perhaps they could be reshaped to include women's rights. And a year later, she decided to move west with the New England Immigrant Aid Society to Kansas. And the mission of the New England Aid Society, organized in Boston, was to ensure that Kansas was a free state. At the time, as many of you know, Kansas was just beginning the people in Kansas were just beginning to settle it, and the question was, would it be slave or would it be free? In her memoir, she described some of her thinking at the time. I could accomplish much more for women there in the new state of Kansas than I could in conservative old Vermont, whose prejudices were so much stronger than its convictions. Well, and as it turned out, she did. Now here is Nichols after she went out to Kansas. She looks quite different, and I do like this picture. She became what I call a frontier feminist, the title of my biography of Nichols. Here you have the mother of Kansas. She became a radical abolitionist. She was also invited to address the Constitutional Convention there in 1859, and she helped to write two clauses in the Constitution, one guaranteeing married women's property rights, and the other that women would have equality in all school affairs. Now, this was a vague constitutional provision, but it did allow women to vote in school meetings. So, in Kansas, she achieved what she had hoped to achieve in Vermont. Now, after the Civil War, back in Vermont, there were a few Republican men who believed in universal suffrage, and they made an attempt to amend the Vermont Constitution with regard to sex. They actually organized and led the first Vermont Women's Suffrage Association. But, as it turned out, this turned into a disaster. Most of the newspaper editors ridiculed these suffragists who had been imported from Boston to campaign for them. And they claimed the outsiders were infidels, advocates of free love, and not only that, they didn't speak for Vermont women. In fact, membership after this disaster in the association dissolved, and things were quite quiet for a decade. The absence of Vermont-born suffragists was a big problem in the state. and it allowed lawmakers to maintain that Vermont women didn't want to vote anyway. Most available women were far more likely to join the WCTU. Now that was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, organized to make sure that Vermont men did not drink. Even though Vermont had passed a prohibition law, it was not properly enforced. In fact, it was the WCTU that finally achieved school suffrage in Vermont in 1880. They argued that they needed to help control the Vermont school curriculum, especially with temperance textbooks that would teach the children about the horrors of drinking. But voting in school meetings was really a very meager concession on the part of lawmakers at the time. And not only that, it allowed only tax-paying women to vote. Well, how many women were actually taxpayers? They had to own property of some sort to vote. That meant either they had to own land or they had to have bank stock or other kinds of liquid property. Well, they didn't, because the property was owned by their husbands. But in 1880, the Vermont Women's Suffrage Association was reorganized. And after that, they began pressing for voting in town meetings. But, as I mentioned earlier, they made very little progress for 30 years, until 1917. Now this woman, Annette Parmalee, is my next example of Vermont suffragist. She became the press secretary and lobbyist of the Vermont Women's Suffrage Association in 1907. And unfortunately, we don't have a good image of her. This is very poor. It comes from a billboard, ephemera that that we have in our archives here. Parmalee used every argument that the suffragists had employed in the 19th century to argue for why women should vote. But she began to shift away from the kind of argument that Nichols had put forward back to the arguments with respect to equality, that women were equal to men. She claimed they were citizens and they were taxpayers just like men, and they should be rightful voters. But she kept all of the other arguments in her bucket as well. And this is a list of 17 reasons why women should have the ballot. In the first column, she's presented the arguments for equality, hoping everyone would read those, of course, first. But in the second two, it's sort of an amalgam of other arguments that had been put forward in the late 19th century by white women who were working strategically to convince men to vote. So here she's got the arguments that women were more moral, they were more domestic, and they were native-born. They were educated. Basically, white women. They were more civic-minded compared to foreign-born and bad men. So those were the kinds of arguments that other leaders had been using, that Parmalee and Vermont leaders were also using at the time. And this is the kind of thing that made African American women and working class women question whether these middle class women really had the right to speak for all women. But Parmalee did not get away from the ridicule either. You see, was she a suffragist or was she a suffragette hornet? Now, the men in the legislature called her a suffragette hornet because she buzzed around the legislature and didn't leave them alone. But a suffragette was a British advocate for suffrage. in the U.S., suffragists insisted upon using the word suffragist. So to call Parmalee a suffragette was to sort of belittle her as unimportant. But she went right along with it. She was able to deal with it actually far better than Mrs. Nichols. And at one point, the lawmakers even had a mock legislative session, which they often did, and one legislator dressed up and impersonated Annette Parmalee, which was the hit of the evening. And she was in the gallery, laughing along with all the men. But she got back at them. She designed her own program, which she took around several communities in the state, a public hearing on what she called the man's suffrage bill. And here she reversed the gender hierarchy, and she posed as the Speaker of the House, and other suffragists were in the audience, standing up to question or argue why men should get the vote. And this was supposed to be a great attraction to bring people out and hear about women's suffrage. Well, that didn't stop the lawmakers from saying most women did not want to vote, at least those in their town. Here's how Parmalee described her frustration. 4 years ago, the wise men of the state said they killed the bill because not enough women were interested in it. 2 years ago, they killed our bill because too many women were interested in it. They said we overdid it. 1 year ago, men suggested that only one Vermont woman be secured to present the cause. Our bill, however, met the same fate. Because, they said, women don't get out to vote at the school meeting. Well, of course, at that point she reminded me they can't, because none of them own property, and they're not taxpayers, which many of them did not know. So after studying the statutes, Barre began to realize that it was really difficult to treat men and women equally because men owned most of the property and the unequal distribution of wealth. So to resolve this problem, she decided that one way to convince the men was to suggest a universal poll tax that would be equal to both men and women. At the time, men all paid a poll tax. And she tried to suggest that if we had a set poll tax of $1 or $2, then maybe some of our women could also pay that in order to vote. This was her way of trying to open the local franchise to at least most women instead of just tax-paying them. So even though she used some of the class arguments as a suffragist, she really wanted to open the vote to all women. Well, unfortunately, this move ended her career as a lobbyist. There were other leaders of the association who did not follow or enjoy her philosophy, and they objected to this strategy, and they replaced her and submitted another bill to the legislature in 1915 that was rather vaguely worded. It would have benefited women taxpayers only, and in fact it failed that year, but in 1917 that was the one that was passed. So it's not clear really, were these women blind to the problem? Were they just acting strategically, or in fact were they basically self-interested? Well, Parmalee wasn't sure, but our third suffragist was, and this is Lucy Daniels. She lived in Grafton, and she believed the bill was a trick, she said, by an aristocracy of women voters. It was designed to hoodwink the public into thinking that women in Vermont could vote when very few would qualify. This is an image of Daniels from the mid-1880s. And of course, by this time, it was quite a bit later. It was 15. And so this is when she was younger. It's one of the better images we have of her. She represents the third phase of the movement, when women began to take to the streets. She was not a lobbyist, but she was a woman of direct action. She had few words, but she knew how to act. So she was a wealthy woman. She lived in Grafton, and she did own property. And she decided to refuse to pay her taxes. So she advertised her tax protest on the side of her building here. A square deal, votes for Vermont women. She also actually took out advertisements in local papers for suffrage. She was a progressive, and she was very concerned about the working class women and women's access to the workplace. She refused to be part of what she called the aristocracy. She wrote Parmalee in 1914 when this other group of suffragists presented their bill. She said, the tax collector called on me last of December, and he said, well, I could vote in school meetings, but she said, I just told him, this girl's mother, and she pointed, to her hired housekeeper, she can, and until she can, I shall not, for I am not an aristocrat. Well, that said, Gannis was fairly wealthy, and she lived in Boston in the winter, and associated with many other suffragists in Boston. She also graduated from one of the first law schools for women in 1896. This was a law school program that didn't certify her as a lawyer, but it was one of the first ones that was designed specifically for women. And she knew basically what she was talking about. When Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized the National Women's Party and began protesting in Washington, that was what Lucy Gannis wanted to do. So she became one of the women who stood in front of the White House protesting against President Wilson, asking him, what will you do for women's suffrage, and how long must women wait for liberty? This was a period when women stood every day in front of the White House with these banners and silently protesting the fact that Wilson had not done enough to promote the 19th Amendment. Now, Lucy Daniels stood with them, and as many of you know, many were arrested for obstructing traffic, even though they were silently protesting. Daniels was arrested 3 times and sentenced to jail in Washington, D.C. And she was also jailed again in Boston when she protested with other women from the Women's Party as President Wilson came back from the Paris Peace Conference. All of this was very embarrassing to President Wilson because we were in a war. And at the close of the war, it was obvious that these women certainly deserved liberty as well as the Europeans and other world communities that we had been fighting for. And here is a portrait of Daniels at the end of her life. Now this is interesting because it was done by a friend of hers 10 years after she died in 1957. And you can see she became quite, at least the image here, she's portrayed as quite the radical for that period. This, I mean, it was done in the 1950s, so for that time period, this is quite different from the image of most women. And she was a vegetarian, she supported international causes all over the world. And she had gotten her start, of course, by protesting her local tax collector. And finally, just want to close up here with the final blow to Vermont suffragists was at the moment when Vermont could have become the perfect 36. That phrase was used for the last state that would have been solidified the passage of the 19th Amendment. And Governor Percival Clement refused to call the legislators into special session in order to ratify the amendment. They had actually, to their credit, passed a suffrage bill the prior session, but he vetoed it. And by blocking their ability to ratify the amendment, that left the final state to Tennessee. Vermont finally ratified the amendment after women got the vote in 1921. And that was the year that our first Vermont woman legislator, sat in the House. Edna Beard was elected, and she was in office in 1921. So I think Rachel and I are up for some questions, if there are any out there.
None so far, but I will keep an eye on the comments for just a moment. To anyone who is watching this, if you have a question about anything that Lynn or Rachel said, please go ahead and type a comment on this Facebook video. We'll give you just a moment or two to do so. Hopefully we won't wait too long so it gets awkward, but yeah. But we'll wait for just a moment and see if there are any other questions. But if there are not, hope everyone enjoyed. All right. I'm going to call it. I haven't seen any questions. But if you do have questions, go ahead and type them in. If you're watching this video after the fact, go ahead and type it in, and we'll work on getting you the answers at a later date. We are all still access to email. So thank you both so much for speaking today. Thank you everyone who tuned in, and as I said, please stay tuned to the Vermont Historical Society's Facebook page, to vermonthistory.org. And we do have one question. I'm going to finish this up in a second. Stay tuned to vermonthistory.org and the Vermont Historical Society's Facebook page, and we'll keep posting what we're up to. Okay, I have a question from Jessie Ferrand from the other paper. She says, how would you compare this movement with today's movement? And it's not clear what she means by today's, but sort of women arguing for voting access today, I guess is what I would argue.
Arguing for voting access today?
Yeah, so are there any differences between the way that women argue for suffrage today, and then were there different arguments that they would have used?
Well, I think the issues are quite different. The problem today is more of a political than a gender problem. And what has been called voter suppression is a political problem. And in the suffrage movement, the issues were women really going to become just like men? And people had difficulty adjusting to that for years. And until women moved further and further into the workplace and into positions of responsibility in the professions, which they did by the 1910s, it was unclear whether women could take those responsibilities. And many women thought, oh, this would be a burden on me. I have too much to do. Because they were comfortable in their roles as mothers and homemakers.
And they had a lot to do.
And they had a lot to do, correct. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thank you both again, and thank you to everyone who tuned in.